Good morning and welcome everyone. Whether you are here in person or joining us on Zoom, hello Zoomers, nice to have you with us, or even watching online later. You are all welcome, whether you are a regular attender or a newcomer. Whatever you bring in your heart, whether you come in sadness or joy or out of curiosity, whatever your faith or none, you are all welcome here. We start as usual by lighting our chalice flame as a symbol of our free religious faith. And if you're at home and have a candle, you may like to light it now. Some words by the Reverend Cliff Reed. We kindle the sacred fire as we gather in community, mindful of the brave souls and questing independent minds whose courage won our freedom. Martin Luther King once said, "The hope of the world is still in dedicated minorities. The trailblazers in human, academic, scientific, and religious freedom have always been in the minority." So as we gather to worship today, may it be as such a minority, dedicated to the cause of freedom for all the people of the world. I'm going to read some words based on those originally written. Welcome, do come in, please. So I'm going to read some words based on those originally written by Derek Macaulay, who was a former chief executive officer of the Unitarians in this country. And he wrote it for the 200th anniversary of the Trinity Act, which was in 2013. And this month sees the 200th anniversary of the passing of that act. It was the Unitarian Toleration Act, also known as the Unitarian Relief Act, or the Trinity Act. And this was a significant event in the history of British Unitarianism and free Christianity. As we mark our freedom of worship here in the UK, it is timely to consider the freedom of others elsewhere. The freedom of religious belief and practice, which we now take for granted, still does not exist for millions of people around the world. So maybe let's use this as a springboard to practical action to promote civil and religious freedom the world over. And in such a spirit, I invite you to join in singing our first hymn. It's number 158 in the Purple Book, but the words will appear on the screen. And please stand to sing if you are able. It's number 158. The flame of truth is kindled.
Amongst us moves the
So let us turn to a time of prayer and reflection. And this is a prayer which was in a worship pack about today's topic. We meet together gratefully in the presence of the God of our understanding to commemorate the faith and witness of those who went before us in their devotion to civil and religious liberty. We remember their historic witness to our tradition of freedom and tolerance, and recall their labours, not counting the cost, to establish the principles that we now take for granted. We honour those who in past times have given their lives or did not flinch from sacrifice or suffering for the sake of freedom of belief and of worship. We mark with gratitude the courage of those who, facing persecution, endeavoured to fashion our religious heritage and bring together our community of the free. And we remember especially the achievements of William Smith MP 2 centuries ago. We acknowledge that civil and religious liberty is not universal and pledge ourselves to work for religious freedom the world over. Amen. Spirit of loving tenderness, touch us and be touched by us. Help us to become true lovers of humanity and compassionate friends of all creation. Pardon in us, we pray, our lack of tenderness. Heal in us the injuries we inflict and the injuries we suffer. Hear us into speech. Speak us into action. Use us for your creating work. Make of us a place where your touch reaches out in grace to others, for you are the source of all love in our lives. Amen. Our first reading is, I suppose it's a story in a way, and Edgar was going to read it, but unfortunately his train is so late that he can't be with us, so I'm going to read it instead. And it's by the Reverend Eric Jones, and it's his recollection of a summer of 1963, which was 60 years ago. He writes, "It was the summer of 1963. 2 of us set out along muddy lanes and the wet marshland on the mountainside high above the Aberdare and Merthyr Tydfil valleys. We were looking for a pile of stones which denoted the exact spot of the old Cwmwaiglo farmhouse, that's the Valley of Coal, and the remains of a barn which acted as the dissenters' meeting house. Up to 40 people gathered for worship here in the 1650s, daring to defy the law of the land in order to be able to worship with freedom in a country where religious freedom and tolerance were not allowed. They met at the barn of Cwmwaiglo farmhouse, cleared the hay and straw before worship could begin, rather like we put the chairs out, stood for the whole service whilst their leaders kept watch on nearby vantage points in case the hand of the law came too close. The ruins are still there, the remains of the farmhouse and the barn, with untrimmed stones emerging from the undergrowth. Tom Lewis of Kirkcoed wrote a history of the early dissenters of the area in 1947, and he describes the spot as a dingle of sylvan beauty, screened by a profusion of dense copses and tall, overhanging trees, where, tradition states, the nightingale sang. There was certainly a magic about the place, and the magic has remained with me ever since. The peace and tranquility high above 2 industrial valleys, where people gathered and dared to be different. From the early pioneers at Cwmwaiglo, several places of worship of different traditions have emerged including Unitarian churches in both the Aberdare and Merthyr valleys. I often wonder if we continue to appreciate the sacrifice of those pioneers and embrace the vision of those early dissenters, we may be in danger of forgetting about their determination and courage, letting go an integral part of our heritage. The following words were at the heart of the legislation which was passed in 1813. On the 21st of July, 1813, a statute was passed with the title, "An Act to Relieve Persons who Impugn the Doctrine of the Holy Trinity from Certain Penalties." It is written in rather legalese, but I thought it was important to read what was written. Whereas in the 19th year of His present Majesty, an Act was passed entitled, "An Act for the further relief of Protestant dissenting ministers and schoolmasters, and it is expedient to enact as hereinafter provided, be it enacted, that so much of an Act passed in the first year of King William and Queen Mary, entitled, An Act for exempting His Majesty's Protestant subjects dissenting from the Church of England, from penalties of certain laws, as provide that Act, or anything therein contained, should not extend or be construed to extend to give any ease, benefit, or advantage to persons denying the Trinity, as therein mentioned, be, and the same is hereby repealed. That provisions of another Act, passed in the 9th and 10th years of the reign of King William, entitled, An Act for the more effectual suppressing blasphemy and profaneness, so far as the same relate to persons denying, as therein mentioned respecting the Holy Trinity, be, and the same, are hereby repealed. And whereas it is expedient to repeal an Act passed in the Parliament of Scotland in the first Parliament of King Charles II, entitled, An Act against the Crime of Blasphemy, and another Act passed in the Parliament of Scotland in the first Parliament of King William, entitled, An Act against Blasphemy, which acts respectively ordain the punishment of death, be it thereby enacted that the said acts, and each of them shall be, and the same are, and is, hereby repealed. And that was at the heart of that Act of 1813, and I'll tell you a bit more about that later. And it's time for our second hymn, and it's the hymn in the Purple Book, number 30, Each Seeking Faith, and the words will appear on the screen.
Flashing tongues combine to pray that light will shine.
I'm going to read another prayer, and this is adapted from one by Vincent B. Stillman, and it's entitled Religion. May religion be to us life and joy, a voice of renewing challenge to the best we have and may be. Let it be a call to generous action. Let religion be to us a dissatisfaction with things that are, which bids us serve more eagerly the true and right. Let it be the sorrow that opens for us the way of sympathy, understanding, and service to suffering humanity. Let religion be to us the wonder and lure of that which is only partly known and understood. An eye that glories in nature's majesty and beauty, and a heart that rejoices in deeds of kindness and of courage. Let religion be to us security and serenity because of its truth and beauty, and because of the enduring worth and power of the loyalties it engenders. Let it be to us hope and purpose, and a discovering of opportunities to express our best through daily tasks. Religion, uniting us with all that is admirable in human beings everywhere, holding before our eyes a prospect of the better life for humankind, which each may help to make actual. Amen. And a moment just to reflect on what we've heard so far. The International Council of Unitarians and Universalists in 2002. And after I've read this, there'll be a little silence, maybe for you to reflect on again what those words say, and then a piece of music. And today's opening music and our reflective music are both pieces which some of the people who worked for that act in 1813 may have heard because they'd been composed by then. So this is what Cliff Reed wrote over 20 years ago. We are the Christians who move on, leaving behind what cannot be retained. The creeds written to cement a long dead empire. The justification for slavery, genocide, and witch burning. The refusal to hear other people's truths. An idolized book. A man diminished to a god. We leave these behind and move on, not in arrogance, not unaware of tradition's worth, not creating new bigotries as bad as the old ones, or so we hope. We move on, carrying with us the free and timeless heart of Jesus, faithful to what was said and done in love for liberty by him, by those who follow him. by those who give his spirit, voice and flesh in every time and place. We are the Christians who move on, leaving even the name behind, maybe a name that Jesus never knew. We are the Christians who move on, seeking and sharing the divine heart in everyone, as Jesus did. I've entitled my address Lawbreakers No More, and I hope you come to understand why as we proceed. We live in troubled times. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. But despite what some merchants of doom say about the current state of affairs in this country, really, we are lucky to be living at this time in this country where we can worship our consciences dictate and not as any authority commands. Our recently crowned king included representatives of the major faith groups at his coronation and when he was given the jewels of Scotland more recently. It was not always so. If the king's men of 400 or 500 years ago had caught us saying some of the prayers we used earlier, or singing the words of those hymns, or indeed listening to Cliff Reed's reflective piece on being the Christians who move on, we would have been in serious trouble. Indeed, at some times in the past, our very lives would have been in peril. Why? We would have been breaking the law. We would have been breaking the law? How? Surely not just by joining in with the prayers and the hymns. Well, yes, actually. There is a long and dark history in this country of people being persecuted for daring to hold different religious beliefs from the mainstream. As far back as the reign of Henry V, that golden boy who won Agincourt in the early 1400s, the Lollards, who challenged orthodox religious views and questioned the authority of the Pope, were imprisoned, and several, unfortunately, were burnt as heretics, a most horrible death. We move forward to Tudor times, and what we now call the English Reformation involved enormous changes in the political and religious life of this country. The religious beliefs of succeeding monarchs differed widely, from the Protestant Edward VI to the very Catholic Queen Mary, back to the more Protestant Elizabeth I, who I think tried to negotiate more of a midway. Anyone who didn't change their own beliefs in accordance risked being labelled a heretic and cruelly persecuted. People were thrown into prison. Many men and women lost their lives in that most horrible way at the stake. The last people to die in this way, to be burned as heretics, were Bartholomew Legate and Edward Whiteman in March and April 1612, respectively, in the reign of James I. They rejected many of the accepted religious beliefs, including the concept of the Trinity of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Legate and Whiteman were victims of a really complex series of events, and that included a growing campaign against the Puritans and King James's desire to be seen as a traditional Christian. And some years later, the Pilgrim Fathers in 1620 set sail lastly from this very place to go to America, where they could practice their religion in their own way without fear of persecution. Well, King James soon realised that the general population were against horrible public persecutions like that, and so he contented himself by only throwing dissenters into prison, where they languished for the rest of their lives. In Scotland, as late as 1697, Thomas Aikenhead, a young Edinburgh medical student, rejected the doctrine of the Trinity, for which he was hanged. We move on to the English Civil War, and John Biddle, who was known as the father of English Unitarianism, was imprisoned for what could be described as dissenting beliefs in his writings. His writings were burned, but he was not. And Oliver Cromwell exiled him to the Scilly Isles, where you think he might have been safe, but his story does not have a happy ending. I'll come back to that later. We move forward to 1660, and King Charles II returned from exile and restored the monarchy. Everyone hoped this would herald a new, more liberal age, but within 2 years, the promise of the Restoration was already turning sour. The Act of Uniformity of 1662 was an Act of Parliament requiring the use of all the rites and ceremonies in the Book of Common Prayer. All ministers of religion had to be ordained by recognised bishops and were required to conform to the 39 Articles of Religion, which had been finalised in the reign of the First Elizabeth. I had a look through them while I was preparing this service, and they cover a wide range of things which they were supposed to do or not do. And many of the clergy felt unable to conform to every single one of them. As a result, nearly 2,000 clergymen, including George Hughes, the Puritan vicar of St Andrews, literally just up the road, were forced to leave the established church in what became known as the Great Ejection, 1662. And if you ever visit our Colompton church, you will see that date on the gates there. Well, any of these non-conforming ministers, preferring to follow the dictates of their own conscience, were forced from office. The Act was implemented on St Bartholomew's Day, the 24th of August, 1662, a significant date, because it meant that any minister who did not conform would not be paid his stipend due in the September. So he's lost his living, he's left with no means of income for being brave enough to not agree to certain things which he was told he should. And various other people like curates and teachers and schoolmasters and professors were required to take a further stringent oath. All nonconformists, whatever their beliefs, were excluded from holding civil or military office. They were excluded from receiving legatees. They weren't allowed to adopt children, and they were prevented from being awarded degrees by Oxford and Cambridge universities. What of John Biddle? We thought he was safe in the Scilly Isles. He returned to London. He was again arrested at the time of the 1662 Act and fined £100, which was a great sum in those days. He was unable to pay and was thrown into prison, where he died of fever a few months later. But time passed. Eventually, attitudes softened towards several branches of Protestant nonconformity. Maybe they were no longer perceived as a threat. Unitarians began meeting for worship towards the end of the 17th century, though often in out-of-the-way places, such as described by the Reverend Eric Jones. Out of sight, safe? In 1689, a Toleration Act was passed, and it was amended in 1779 for the further relief of Protestant dissenting ministers and schoolmasters. It gave them considerable relief from statutory penalties and disabilities. But as we heard as I mentioned before the second reading, this relief was not extended to Unitarians. The Act stated that neither this Act nor any clause, article, or thing herein contained shall extend or be construed to extend to any ease, benefit, or advantage to any person that shall deny in his preaching or writing the doctrine of the Blessed Trinity, as it is declared in the 39 Articles of Religion. So, the Unitarians who met in Essex Street in London in 1774 to hear Theophilus Lindsay preach were breaking the law. So was Joseph Priestley, the scientist and Unitarian preacher. He eventually emigrated to America in 1794 after a mob destroyed the chapel where he was minister and his own home and laboratory in July 1791. July seems to be a very significant month, doesn't it? Also regarded as lawbreakers were members of the congregation at the Devonport Unitarian Congregational Chapel, built in 1790. Many worked in the naval dockyard, which was then expanding, but as the records state, the congregation of the chapel decayed in consequence of its being understood that Commissioner Fanshawe intimated that all dockyardsmen who attended the new chapel would be discharged as disloyal subjects, i.e. they would lose their jobs, and the persecutions continued. The chapel is now the cooperative store out near Stonehouse, if anybody wants to go and have a look at it. The original building is beautifully preserved. Unitarians were not given the benefits of the Toleration Act of 1689 and the Act of 1779 until 1813. And we've heard the words of that act. Basically, it repealed certain parts of the earlier acts, removing the risk of prosecution and even death for anyone who dared to practice being a Unitarian. So it was that in 1813, William Smith MP approached all this with considerable politic astuteness. Nowadays, he's remembered primarily as the grandfather of Florence Nightingale. But he was the leading dissenter in Parliament. For 40 years, he chaired the deputies of the three denominations, Independents, Presbyterians and Baptists, the body that represented the dissenting interests in Parliament. He entered Parliament in 1784 and was an MP for 46 years, and all his work was towards reforms of certain aspects of life. He'd worked closely with Wilberforce for the abolition of slavery. He supported Catholic emancipation because they too were denied many of the rights that the Anglicans enjoyed. He opposed the French Revolutionary War and all interference in the internal affairs or government of foreign nations, which was said to be very unpopular. Now he campaigned for an act to give equal rights to Unitarians. He was a patient negotiator, and he laid his foundations firmly. He scotched any objections to his proposed bill by obtaining the consent for change from the Archbishop of Canterbury himself, Charles Manners Sutton. Then Smith approached the government, which was more than willing for him to carry on. He then had another interview with the Archbishop and the Chancellor of the Exchequer. I haven't been able to find out why, but that's what he did. And together they moulded the bill into its final shape. Nothing that could be done to smooth its passage was left undone. The bill was withdrawn when the House of Lords initially opposed parts of it, but another was introduced very quickly. The Unitarian Toleration Act, also known as the Unitarian Relief Act or the Trinity Act, was passed by Parliament on the 21st of July, 1813. The 1813 Act, probably due to the haste in which it had been passed, did not repeal clauses in the Blasphemy Acts affecting Ireland. It also left blasphemy as a crime under the common law, and that was not ultimately repealed until as late as 2008. It was still, however, a triumph for the Unitarians. As Smith's biographer, Richard W. Davies, states, except in Ireland, Unitarianism was now legal in the United Kingdom. The name could be used with impunity, which was probably the bill's most important practical effect. It meant Unitarians could finally worship with no fear of persecution. Smith's part cannot be underestimated, and it was recognised at the time. Indeed, it was popularly known as Mr. William Smith's Bill. There was a special general meeting of the Unitarian Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge and the Practice of Virtue by the Distribution of Books in Essex Street in London on July the 30th, 1813. It was chaired by the Reverend Thomas Belsham. Long speeches were made, and I'm not going to quote them all here, you'll be glad to know. But it concluded thus. Having expressed their great satisfaction with the passage of the Act, and offering their thanks to Parliament, they resolved that this society hail the present measure as an auspicious prelude to that happy day when all penal laws and political restrictions on religious grounds shall be forever abolished, when an invidious and limited toleration shall give way to universal religious liberty, and when all, without distinction, shall be entitled by law to the possession of those civil and political privileges which are the birthright of Britons. At William's death in 1835, his obituary in the Christian Reformer states, "These were times of no small personal danger to any man of any note who dared to profess liberal opinions. But Mr. Smith never hesitated or faltered. He confessed his creed, he steadily and fearlessly pursued his courses, and was prepared for all the consequences." Gosh. Thank you, William Smith. How many of us sitting here today would have had his energy, his commitment, his perseverance, and yes, his courage to carry this out? How many of us sitting here today would have had the courage of those first nonconformists in 1662 to show publicly what our beliefs are at the risk of losing our livelihood? And how many of us sitting here today would have had the courage of those earlier men, Edward Whiteman or Bartholomew Legate, or the young student Thomas Aikenhead, to show publicly what our beliefs are? at such a terrible personal cost? I'm not sure that I would. But we are the lucky ones. Sadly, even today in some parts of the world, people do not enjoy these freedoms. Paul Marshall wrote 15 years ago, "There is no group in the world that does not suffer to some degree because of its beliefs, including the Baha'is in Iran, the Ahmadis in Pakistan, the Buddhists in China, Tibet, the Falun Gong in China, the Christians in Saudi Arabia, the Muslim Rohingya fleeing the violence in Myanmar." The list goes on. Atheists and agnostics and Jehovah's Witnesses can all suffer from religious persecution. In Indonesia, it's in principle illegal to be an atheist, and any Saudi Arabian must by law be a Muslim. Anyone who pronounces himself to be an atheist faces a real risk of prosecution. Violations of religious freedom worldwide are massive, widespread, and in many parts of the world intensifying. What can we do? Well, we can support the International Association for Religious Freedom, which was established over 100 years ago by Unitarians and other religious liberals. It works to support those who are suffering or may suffer from the denial of their religious freedom. It has an young adult program. It works to prevent acts of religious intolerance before they happen. So we can do that. But I think in closing, I'll say that most importantly is for each one of us to really value the religious freedom we enjoy today. It was won at such cost by those of previous generations. And it's our privilege and our right and our duty to keep it alive for those that come after us, to keep the light alive and to make it shine. I'm going to invite you to join our final hymn in a moment, but to explain to you, our closing video is one of a song which many Unitarians enjoy. I can remember a group of children singing it at one of the General Assemblies I attended some years ago. This version is by an American Unitarian Universalist adult choir. It's a virtual choir. It was probably recorded during the lockdown. But the words appear beneath the singers. So when it comes to it, if you feel like joining in, feel free. But firstly, let's sing our final hymn. And it's... A few closing words. We stand on the shoulders of giants, of the Unitarian and free Christian men and women who gave selflessly for the principles we still hold dear. Let us be worthy heirs to our proud tradition of freedom, reason, and tolerance. And may we all go in peace. Amen.